I want to begin with something philosophy does not usually begin with, an acknowledgement of why I am doing this particular episode. Not long ago, I lost my brother. He was my only sibling. He had struggled for years with addiction and depression, and he died by suicide. I am not going to spend the episode on the details of that. This is not that kind of show, and grief is not a performance. But I am also not going to pretend I came to this topic from a distance as an interested observer. I did not. I came to it the way most people come to philosophy about grief, because I needed it. Welcome to Philosophy for Lunch. I'm Sean, and today I'm on my own. This episode is for anyone who has lost someone in any of the ways loss arrives, sudden or slow, expected or not. It is for anyone who has found the ways our culture talks about grief, the stages, the timelines, the instruction to move on not quite right, and has never had the vocabulary to say why. And it is, I suppose, for anyone who is trying to figure out what to do with a loss that does not resolve cleanly. Because some losses do not. What I have found is that philosophy does not fix grief, but it offers something I did not expect: honesty. Some of the finest minds in the history of human thought have sat with exactly what you are sitting with: the absence, the unreality of it, the strange way the world keeps moving when something central has stopped, and they have written about it without flinching. That is what today is about. Big ideas. Let's go. Before we get to what philosophy says about grief, I want to make sure we are being precise about what grief actually is, because I think it gets conflated with things it is not, and those conflations matter. Grief is not sadness, though it contains sadness. Sadness is a mood, a temporary emotional state that arises in response to loss and passes. Grief is something more structural. It is a reorganization of the self around an absence. When someone who was central to your life is gone, the shape of your days changes. The habits of thought you built around them, the running commentary you maintain for them, the future scenarios that included them, all of that keeps firing for a while, reaching for something that is no longer there. Grief is the process of your whole self catching up to a reality that your habits have not yet absorbed. C.S. Lewis, writing in his journal after his wife Joy died, described this with unusual precision. He wrote that grief felt like fear, the same fluttering in the stomach, the same restlessness, the urge to swallow. He kept expecting to turn a corner and be ambushed by it. And what he noticed was that the absence was not simply an empty space, it was an active presence. It kept making itself felt in all the places she should have been. That observation that grief is not emptiness, but a kind of negative presence, is philosophically important. It suggests that love does not simply end when the person does. It continues transformed. The grief is the love with nowhere to go. That phrase is not mine. It comes from a number of contemporary grief writers, but I think it is one of the most accurate descriptions of grief's phenomenology I have encountered. The popular framework of the 5 stages, denial, anger, bargaining, depression, acceptance, was introduced by Elizabeth Kubler-Ross in 1969, based on her work with terminally ill patients describing their own anticipated deaths, not with bereaved people at all. Kubler-Ross herself later regretted how rigidly the stages were applied, and the research since has not been kind to the model as a description of how grief actually unfolds. Grief is not a staircase. It is not a linear progression from one state to the next. It is recursive, unpredictable, season-dependent. It comes back when you least expect it, and in forms you do not recognize as grief until you are already in them. What philosophy offers is not a better stage model. It offers something more honest, a set of frameworks for thinking about what loss means, what the self is that gets reorganized by it, and how a human being can live well in the aftermath. Not past grief, but through it, and with it. I want to start with Boethius, because I think he is one of the most extraordinary cases in the history of philosophy, and because what he wrote came from a place of genuine extremity rather than academic distance. Anicius Manlius Severinus Boethius was a Roman statesman and philosopher, one of the most learned men of his era, who served the Ostrogothic king Theodoric as a senior official in the early 6th century. In 524 CE, he was accused of treason. The charges appear to have been fabricated, imprisoned, and executed. He was somewhere in his 40s. While he waited for his death in a prison in Pavia, he wrote a book called The Consolation of Philosophy. It is one of the most widely read books of the medieval world. The argument philosophy makes is Stoic in character, drawing on the tradition Marcus Aurelius also drew on. Fortune, she argues, is by nature inconstant. The goods of fortune, wealth, position, reputation, The love of those around you are not truly yours. They were always on loan. The wheel of fortune turns, and those who have built their well-being on what fortune gives will suffer when fortune takes it back. The only genuine good, the only thing that cannot be taken from you, is virtue, the quality of your own soul. I want to be honest about both what is compelling and what is insufficient in this. What is compelling? Boethius is right that a great deal of human suffering comes from treating contingent goods as though they were unconditional ones, from believing that your happiness depends on outcomes you cannot control, from making your sense of self so dependent on external circumstances that when those circumstances change, as they always eventually do, the self collapses with them. The Stoic insight here is real and important. What is insufficient? The grief that follows the death of someone you love is not simply the grief of losing a fortune. It is not a category error about the nature of goods. The person was not a possession. They were a world, and when that world ends, what is lost is not something that was on loan. It was something that was real and irreplaceable and is now gone. What Boethius gives us, at minimum, is the example of a person who turned to philosophy not as an academic exercise, but as a survival practice, as the one resource available to him in the cell. Whether or not his specific arguments are fully adequate to grief, the act of thinking hard in the face of loss, of refusing to be reduced to pure suffering, is itself a kind of answer to the question of what philosophy is for. There is also something in the structure of the Consolation that I find philosophically interesting beyond the argument itself. Boethius writes it as a dialogue, as a conversation with an interlocutor who challenges him, pushes back on his self-pity, refuses to simply validate his suffering. That is a different model of companionship in grief than the one our culture usually offers. Our culture tends toward empathy in the sense of validation, meeting the person where they are, reflecting their feelings back to them, not challenging anything. But there is also value in the Boethian model, the presence that takes your grief seriously enough to think with you about it, rather than just feeling with you about it. The distinction matters because grief is not only an emotional experience, it raises genuine questions about meaning, about value, about what remains when someone is gone, and those questions deserve genuine engagement, not just sympathy. Albert Camus does not write directly about grief in the way Boethius does, but his philosophy of the absurd, his account of what it means to live in a universe that does not respond to our need for meaning, is, I think, one of the most honest frameworks for understanding what loss forces us to confront. The absurd, for Camus, is not a property of the world alone, nor of the human mind alone, but of the collision between them. Humans have an irrepressible need for clarity, meaning, and coherence. The universe offers none of those things. It is indifferent. It does not explain itself. It does not justify its operations by any standard we would recognize as humane. And grief is one of the places where that collision is most nakedly felt. You lose someone you love, someone whose existence seemed to you self-evidently good, whose continued presence in the world seemed like something the universe ought to want, and the universe simply does not care. The absence is total and arbitrary and unexplained. Camus' response to the absurd was not to deny it, not to resolve it through religion or philosophy or any framework that makes the universe's indifference into a form of hidden meaning. His response was revolt, not in the political sense, in the existential sense. The refusal to accept the terms. The decision to go on living and creating and loving in full awareness that none of it is underwritten by cosmic significance, not because significance doesn't matter, but precisely because it does. There is something in this that I think speaks directly to grief. The temptation in grief is to reach for an explanation for a reason why this person died, for a framework that makes the loss meaningful, for a story that justifies the suffering. Camus would say, be careful with that temptation. Not because meaning is bad, but because the meaning you construct to make loss bearable may be less honest than the grief itself. The grief is real. The love that generated it was real. Those facts do not require a cosmic justification to be worth honoring. His novel, The Stranger, opens with one of the most famous sentences in 20th century literature. Mother died today, or maybe yesterday. I can't be sure. That flatness, the narrator's strange inability to fully feel or respond to his mother's death, is not a portrait of sociopathy. It is a portrait of dissociation, of the way the mind protects itself from what it cannot yet absorb. And the novel that follows is, in part, an account of what happens when you have never learned to grieve honestly, when you have suppressed the feeling so completely that you can no longer locate it. The Plague, which Camus published in 1947, is in some ways his most direct engagement with collective grief, with what happens to a community when death arrives in large and indiscriminate quantities. The novel is set in Oran, a city sealed off by an outbreak of bubonic plague. People die, people lose, people they love. And the various characters represent different possible responses: denial, heroic action, religious acceptance, hedonism, despair, solidarity. What Camus keeps returning to is the doctors and workers who go on doing their jobs not because they believe the universe will reward them, or because they have found a reason that makes the dying acceptable, but simply because someone has to and they are someone. I find that framework genuinely useful for thinking about what grief asks of us. Not to find the reason, not to accept what is not acceptable, but to keep going, to keep doing the work of being present and useful and alive in full acknowledgement that the loss is real and the universe has not explained itself. That is a form of revolt. And it is, I think, one of the more honest responses to loss that philosophy has produced. I want to spend some time with more contemporary philosophical work on grief, because I think the last few decades have produced some of the most practically useful thinking on this subject, thinking that takes seriously both the phenomenology of grief and the philosophical questions it raises. The philosopher Michael Cholby has argued that grief is not simply a response to loss, but a form of practical identity work. When we grieve, we are not just feeling sad about the absence of the person, we are renegotiating who we are. Because the people we love are partly constitutive of our identity, they shape how we see ourselves, what we value, what we believe we are capable of. When they die, we have to figure out who we are without that relationship as part of our self-understanding. Grief, in Cholby's framework, is the labor of that renegotiation. It is not a passive experience of suffering. It is active work, even when it does not feel like it. This reframing matters practically because it changes how you think about what grief is for. If grief is just suffering, if it is simply the emotional pain of absence, then the goal is obviously to minimize it and get through it as quickly as possible. But if grief is identity work, then it has a function. It is not an obstacle to returning to normal life. It is the process by which normal life gets rebuilt around a new reality. Rushing it does not protect you. It just means the work gets deferred, and it will find you later. There is also the question of what we owe the dead, a philosophical issue that gets surprisingly little attention given how much most people think about it. The philosopher Barbara Gale Montero and others have written about the persistence of our obligations to those who have died. Most ethical frameworks are built around obligations to living persons, to people whose well-being can be affected by our actions. But we clearly feel obligations to the dead, to honor their wishes, to remember them accurately, to protect their reputations. Are these obligations real, or are they a kind of sentimental fiction? The philosopher Geoffrey Murphy has written about what he calls the grammar of grief, the way grief has a structure and a logic that, when understood, makes it less arbitrary and more navigable. Part of that grammar is the difference between mourning and melancholy. Mourning is the normal process of grief. Painful, recursive, but ultimately oriented toward reintegration. Melancholy, in the philosophical and psychological tradition going back to Freud, is what happens when mourning gets stuck. When the self becomes so identified with the lost person that it cannot let the loss be a loss. When the grief turns inward and becomes a kind of self-destruction rather than a form of remembering. The dual process model of grief, developed by Margaret Strobe and Henk Schutt, offers a more contemporary psychological framework that I think aligns well with what philosophy has been saying. Their model suggests that healthy grieving involves oscillation moving between loss-oriented processing, where you are directly engaging with the grief, and restoration-oriented processing, where you are attending to the demands of life and building new roles and relationships. Neither mode alone is sufficient. Pure immersion in the loss without any return to life leads to the melancholic stuckness Freud described. Pure focus on getting back to normal without processing the loss leads to the deferred grief that shows up later, usually at the worst possible moment. What I find useful about this model is that it gives permission for the good days. Grief culture sometimes implies that if you are functioning, if you laughed at something, if you had a good evening, if you are not thinking about the person every minute, then you are doing it wrong, or you did not love them enough. The dual process model says, the back and forth is the process. The days when you can engage with life are not a betrayal of the grief. They are part of how the grief does its work. I want to be honest about the limits of what philosophy can offer grief, because I think there's a risk in this kind of episode of making it seem like the right framework will make grief manageable. I do not believe that, and I do not want to imply it. Philosophy cannot make the absence less real. It cannot give you back what was taken. It cannot explain, in any ultimately satisfying way, why this person and not someone else, why now and not later, why this particular loss was part of the story your life turned out to tell. The explanations that get offered, theological, philosophical, psychological, are all partial. They illuminate something. None of them closes the question. And I think that is okay. I think one of the things philosophy can do for grief is give you permission to leave the question open. Our culture is profoundly uncomfortable with unresolved grief. There is enormous social pressure to be okay, to have processed the loss, to have found meaning in it, to be moving forward. That pressure is not malicious. It comes from genuine care and from the discomfort most people feel in the presence of raw grief. But it can be damaging. It can make the person who is grieving feel that their grief is excessive, that their inability to find meaning is a personal failure, that they are doing grief wrong. Philosophy, good philosophy, refuses that pressure. It insists on looking at the thing honestly, even when honesty is uncomfortable. Boethius did not pretend his situation was acceptable. Camus did not pretend the universe was fair. The contemporary philosophers of grief I mentioned do not offer a program for getting over loss. They offer a more truthful account of what the experience actually is. And that truthfulness is, in its own way, a form of company. What philosophy can do is give you language for what you are experiencing. That is not a small thing. One of the cruelties of intense grief is that it is isolating. It feels like no one else has been where you are, like the specific texture of your loss is unreachable by anyone who has not lived it. Knowing that Boethius sat in a cell with this, that C.S. Lewis mapped the phenomenology of it with such precision, that Camus built an entire philosophy, partly in response to it, that does not take the grief away. But it means you are not alone in it. You are in a very long conversation with people who understood exactly why this is so hard. Philosophy can also give you a framework for thinking about your obligations going forward. Not in a legalistic sense, but in the sense of, what does it mean to live a life that honors this person? What did they care about that I can carry forward? What did they give me that I have not yet fully used? Those are not questions that dissolve grief, but they are questions that give grief somewhere to go, that begin to transform it from pure suffering into something that has a direction. Nicholas Wolterstorff, a philosopher who lost his son Eric in a mountain climbing accident, wrote one of the most honest accounts of grief I have read. He writes as a Christian philosopher, and the book engages with faith and its limits under pressure. But what strikes me most is not his theology, it is his refusal to arrive at resolution. He does not end the book having found the reason. He ends it having found a way to carry the absence. He writes that he will not forget his son, will not stop missing him, and that this is not a failure of healing. It is a form of faithfulness. I said at the start that philosophy offers grief, not comfort, but company. I want to revisit that, because I think it might be slightly wrong. Or not wrong exactly, but incomplete. What the best philosophy of grief offers is a kind of honest companionship, which is different from false comfort, but is also not nothing. False comfort says, it will be okay. Everything happens for a reason. They are in a better place. Those formulations may be sincere, and they may even be true, but they have the structure of a door closing. They want to end the conversation with grief, rather than sit inside it. Honest companionship says, I know, it is as bad as you think it is. The absence is real, and you are going to have to figure out how to live with it, and I am here while you do. I think about Boethius writing in that prison cell, not reaching for consolation exactly, but for clarity. He is about to die. He knows it, and what he does with that knowledge is write carefully, rigorously, beautifully about what it means to value something truly rather than contingently. Whether or not his specific argument fully holds up, the act itself is remarkable. He could have spent his last weeks in pure terror or despair. He spent them thinking. That choice to think rather than simply suffer is itself a philosophical act, and it is available to us too. The grief that I find most philosophically interesting and most personally recognizable is the kind that does not want resolution, shallow, the kind that wants to stay close to the person who is gone. There is a way of grieving that is actually a form of loyalty, a refusal to let the loss become just another thing that happened and was integrated and is now past. That grief is trying to say, this mattered. You mattered. I am not going to do you the disservice of pretending I am fine. I do not think that kind of grief needs to be cured. I think it needs to be understood. And I hope that understanding it, having language for it, knowing that it is a recognized and respected human experience rather than a pathology to be treated, makes it slightly more bearable, not less real, not over sooner. Just a little more possible to inhabit without losing yourself entirely. I want to say one more thing about time. The conventional wisdom is that grief fades with time. And in some sense, that is true. The acute pain of the early weeks and months does not remain at that intensity. But I think fades is the wrong word. What changes over time is not the love and not exactly the loss, but your relationship to both. The grief becomes more integrated, woven into the fabric of who you are, rather than something separate that ambushes you. You carry it differently. It takes up a different kind of space. But it does not go away, and I think the expectation that it should, the social pressure to be over it after some culturally specified period, is one of the crueler things we do to each other around death. Claire is back. Next week, we are talking about Aristotle's happiness, the argument that pleasure is not enough, that flourishing requires virtue and community and the full cultivation of what you are capable of. It is a conversation about living well, which, after this episode, feels like exactly the right place to go next. If this episode was for you, if you are in the middle of it right now, I want to say directly, I am sorry. The company philosophy offers is real, but it is not the same as having someone who knew them sitting with you. Both things can be true. If you found this useful, share it with someone who might need it. That is how this show finds the people it is meant for. Sources and further reading are in the show notes. We are Philosophy for Lunch. New episodes every Sunday. Big ideas, human conversations. See you next week.